There is a kind of mind that does not simply look at the world. It reads it. It feels the weight of what is unspoken in a room before a single word is exchanged. It senses the ending of things before the ending arrives. It dreams in symbols it cannot translate, but somehow understands. It has always known in some wordless, aching way that it perceives something others do not, and it has paid a price for that, knowing that no one around it has ever fully witnessed. If something in those words just moved through your chest like recognition, stay. This is for you. And if you have never had a name for what you carry, for this exhausting, luminous, isolating way of moving through existence, Carl Jung had one. He studied it, he mapped it, he lived it himself, and he left behind a warning that most people who think deeply have never heard. Because the very nature of deep thinking makes certain warnings invisible until the damage is already done. Before we go further, if this channel has ever reached into something real in you, if you have ever watched a video here and felt seen in a way that ordinary life rarely offers, take a moment right now and subscribe. Leave a like. It costs nothing, and it means that this work reaches the people who need it most. We are building something here, quietly, for those who have always lived a little outside the ordinary world. You belong here. Now, let us begin. Jung wrote in Psychological Types, published in 1921, that intuition is not a gift in the way most people romanticize gifts. It is not a pleasant bonus attached to an otherwise ordinary mind. It is a function, a specific, dominant mode of perceiving reality that bypasses the ordinary senses and arrives at knowledge through routes the conscious mind cannot fully account for. He called it perception via the unconscious. The intuitive type in Jung's framework does not think their way to an answer, does not feel their way to it, does not observe their way to it through careful sensory attention. They simply know, and then they must live with what they know. That word know is deceptively simple. What it actually means, in the lived reality of a deeply intuitive person, is something closer to this. You are perpetually ahead of events. You see the shape of something before it takes form. You feel betrayal before the betrayer has decided to betray. You sense collapse before the structure shows a single visible crack. You carry within you a kind of inner knowing that operates faster and deeper than reason and the particular loneliness of your life. And it has been lonely, even when surrounded by people, comes from the fact that you cannot prove what you perceives. You cannot show anyone the evidence. You cannot explain the path your mind traveled to arrive at the conclusion it has arrived at. You just know. And others who do not know in this way look at you with that particular flatness in the eyes that the truly intuitive person learns to recognize early, the flatness of someone who has decided you are strange. You learned to keep the knowledge to yourself, or you tried to. Occasionally it broke through, and occasionally you were right in ways that were startling enough to disturb people, and that disturbed them even more than being wrong would have. Being right when you had no right to be right is its own kind of social crime. This is not metaphor. This is Jungian typology applied with precision to a reality you have been living your entire life without a map. Jung observed that every psychological type carries within it both a crown and a curse, and that the two are not separable. The crown is the curse is the crown. The intuitive mind's greatest power, its capacity to perceive what others cannot, is simultaneously its greatest wound, because perception at that depth does not come free. It comes with a cost that accumulates across a lifetime, and the people who bear it often do not realize the cost is being extracted until they are already depleted in ways they cannot name. To understand this, you need to understand how Jung categorized the human mind, not as a collection of symptoms or personality quirks, but as a structured system with a dominant function, an auxiliary function, and what he called the inferior function, the least developed, least conscious part of the psyche, the one that carries the most primitive and the most dangerous energy. For the deeply intuitive person, the inferior function is sensation. This is specific and important. Sensation, the function of the present moment, of physical reality, of embodied experience, of what is here, now, concrete, real, is the intuitive type's most neglected, most underdeveloped dimension. While the intuitive mind ranges freely across possibilities, symbols, patterns, futures, connections that do not yet exist in visible form, the present moment remains strangely inaccessible. The body signals pain and the intuitive type overrides it to keep thinking. The world demands practical attention, and the intuitive mind finds that practical attention somehow exhausting in a way pure contemplation never is. The ground beneath the feet goes unnoticed, while the sky above is mapped in extraordinary detail. Jung called this the transcendent function in reverse, a kind of perpetual upward flight that paradoxically leaves the person with no foundation, and without foundation, the crown becomes very heavy. You have felt this heaviness, perhaps not always, and perhaps you have learned to mask it well, because the intuitive mind is also skilled at constructing a persona, Jung's word for the mask we present to the social world, that appears competent, contained, even brilliant. The persona of the intuitive type often reads to outsiders as someone who has figured something out that others haven't. There is a quality of quiet depth, of seeming to operate from a richer interior than most. People sense it, they are drawn to it, and faintly unsettled by it in equal measure. But behind the persona, and this is where Jung's warning begins, something else is quietly accumulating. Jung used the term psychic inflation to describe a specific dangers that arise when a person becomes identified with their dominant psychological function or with an archetype larger than the individual ego. Inflation, in the Jungian sense, is not simply arrogance. It is more subtle and more dangerous than ordinary arrogance. It is the gradual merging of the ego, the personal, bounded self, with something impersonal and vast. The intuitive type, by the nature of their function, spends enormous amounts of psychological energy in contact with the collective unconscious. They are not simply thinking private thoughts. They are, in some real sense, perceiving patterns that arise from the deeper strata of the psyche that is shared across humanity. This is the crown, access to something that transcends the merely personal. And this is where the curse lives, because the ego, which is small, which is limited, which is human, can begin to mistake the reception of these larger patterns for ownership of them. The intuitive person begins, slowly, without ever making a deliberate choice, to confuse their gift with their identity, to believe that because they perceive what others cannot, they are more. Not simply equipped differently, but worth more. Seeing more becomes, in the inflation, being more. Jung watched this happen. He described it with precision and without mercy. He noted that the intuitive type, when possessed by this inflation, begins to exhibit a particular pattern. They move through life as though the ordinary rules of human existence, commitment, consequence, limitation, the hard dayness of dailiness of being a body in a world, apply to other people but not to them. They are always, in some subtle way, already preparing for the next thing, the more important thing, the truer thing that waits beyond the horizon of the present. The present is a way station. The current relationship is real, but not quite the relationship. The current work is meaningful, but not quite the true work. There is always something approaching that will finally be commensurate with the depth of what they feel themselves to be. Jung had a name for this archetypal pattern. He called it the Puer Aeternus, the eternal youth, the Puer Aeternus, the child who will not enter the weight of ordinary life. Not because of weakness, exactly, and this is critical to understand, but because of a kind of devastating fidelity to a vision that was perhaps real, perhaps genuinely numinous, but that has become distorted by the ego's refusal to descend from it. The intuitive type is particularly vulnerable to pure possession. This is Jung's warning in its most specific form, because intuition itself, as a function, shares certain qualities with the poor. It lives in possibility. It moves toward potential. It resists the finality of commitment, which always closes other doors. It prefers the open horizon to the settled ground. These are genuine aspects of a genuine function. But when the archetype seizes the ego, these characteristics stop being a mode of perception and become a mode of avoidance disguised as vision. You are waiting for the real life to begin. You have always been waiting. There is a persistent sense, which you may never have spoken aloud to anyone, that your actual life, the life that matches the depth of what you sense within yourself, has not yet properly started. The things that have been real, some of them deeply real, some of them devastating in their realness. But there is always a quality of not quite yet that runs beneath everything, as though the full self is being held in reserve for something that has not yet arrived. This feeling is ancient. It is in Ovid's mythology, where the pure figure appears as the divine child forever poised between worlds. It is in the Gnostic texts Jung studied obsessively, the stranger in a strange land, the exile who knows a home they cannot return to. The intuitive mind is drawn to these stories with a recognition that feels like memory. But Jung's warning was this, that recognition is not permission. The exile myth, lived literally, becomes a life of gorgeous incompleteness. A person who is always almost there, always on the edge of the truest thing, never quite landing. Now look at your dreams, because the unconscious has been trying to speak to you about this for longer than you know. The dreams of the deeply intuitive persons are rarely simple. They are dense with symbol. They carry the quality of messages from somewhere specific, not random synaptic noise, but structured communication in a language that uses images instead of words. Jung devoted his life to understanding this language, and he arrived at a position that is both humbling and extraordinary, that the dream is not the product of the dreaming person's personal unconscious alone. It draws on something deeper, the collective unconscious, the stratum of psychic material that is shared across all human beings, that carries the accumulated symbolic wisdom of the species across millennia. And the intuitive type, whose very function is perception through the unconscious, tends to dream at this level with particular frequency and particular intensity. You may have dreamed of flying, not the anxiety flight of someone escaping, but genuine flight, the sensation of moving through space above the world, seeing it spread beneath you in its entirety, the particular clarity of perception that comes with altitude. This dream has a long symbolic history. In Jungian analysis, it tends to appear at the boundary between the pure inflation and the beginning of its confrontation. The dreaming psyche showing you where you are, above the world, seeing everything, touching nothing. You may have dreamed of water, vast, deep, sometimes still, sometimes moving, the ocean appearing in doorways, flooding familiar rooms, rising without apparent origin. Water, in the Jungian symbolic register, is the unconscious itself. Its appearance in dreams signals that something from the depths is pressing toward consciousness. For the intuitive type, this is often the sensation function demanding recognition, the body, the present, the physical reality that has been neglected in favor of the sky, rising to insist on its own existence. You may have dreamed of being in a house with rooms you did not know existed. You explore them. Some are beautiful, Some are disturbing. Some contain things you recognize as yours, though you have no conscious memory of placing them there. This is among the most specifically Jungian of all dream motifs. The house is the psyche. The unknown rooms are the unlived portions of the self. The intuitive type who has been living only in the sky, in the world of vision and pattern and possibility, often dreams of the rooms below, the basement, the cellar, the underground space where the sensation function, the body, the earthbound self, waits. These dreams are not decoration. They are the psyche's attempt to complete itself. Jung used a Greek mythological figure to illuminate the particular wound that belongs to this kind of mind. The figure is Prometheus, not in the popular rendering of Prometheus as simply the rebel who stole fire, but in the deeper mythological reality. Prometheus is the one who sees ahead. His name in ancient Greek means precisely this: forethought. He perceives what the gods have not yet decided to reveal. He carries the knowledge of the future as a burden rather than a comfort, and he pays for his seeing with a punishment that is specifically, deliberately, bodily, chained to a rock, his liver torn out daily, the most visceral and physical of torments inflicted on the one who lives most completely in his mind. The punishment, in Jungian terms, is the inferior function rising in compensation. The man or woman who lives entirely in vision, in symbol, in the possible, the body extracts its fee. The psyche maintains a balance that the conscious ego often violently resists. When the intuitive mind has gone too far into the sky, too long, the inferior function does not politely request attention. It erupts. It takes the form of sudden physical illness, of a bodily breakdown that cannot be explained by ordinary medicine. It takes the form of collapse, not mental breakdown in the clinical sense, though that too occurs, but the collapse of the infrastructure of the inflated life. The vision that could not be grounded falls, the relationships that could not quite be committed to end. The work that was always almost the true work runs out of time to become anything. Prometheus unchained in the mythological tradition requires not a hero to rescue him. It requires Chiron, the wounded healer, the one who carries an unhealing wound and from that wound generates the capacity to heal others. This is the other side of the intuitive type's mythology, that the very suffering that comes from the curse of deep perception, when consciously integrated rather than defended against, becomes the source of something genuinely rare, the capacity to accompany others through depths that ordinary consciousness cannot reach. But Chiron cannot emerge until the inflation is confronted. The crown cannot be worn with grace until the curse has been fully known. There are specific signs that the intuitive mind is in the grip of its own shadow, not malfunctioning, but functioning in the way it was designed, while the ego has misappropriated the function for its own inflation. Recognizing these signs is not comfortable. Jung never promised comfort. He promised transformation, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more demanding. The first sign is the sensation of being chronically misunderstood, and the subtle pride that lives inside that sensation. There is a real version of this experience. The intuitive person genuinely is often misunderstood because their perceptions operate faster and at greater depth than the social structures around them are equipped to receive. This is real, but the shadow version, the version that serves inflation, is when the misunderstanding becomes identity. When no one truly knows me shifts from an observation about the difficulty of communication to a badge of distinction. When being perceived as strange or unusual begins to feel, quietly, like evidence of being special. The misunderstanding that should drive the intuitive type toward deeper and more skillful expression of their perceptions instead becomes a reason to stop trying. The second sign is the provisional life. Jung wrote about this with particular attention in relation to the poor, but it applies with specific force to the intuitive type in inflation. The life that is always in preparation, the relationship that is real but somehow temporary, even when the other person does not know it, the career that is a placeholder, the city, the house, the identity, all of these carrying a quality of impermanence that is experienced internally as open-ended freedom, but that, from the outside, and eventually from the inside too, reveals itself as a form of fear. The fear of commitment is, in Jungian terms, the fear of the inferior function. Commitment requires sensation, presence in this moment, this body, this specific form the life has taken. The intuitive mind in inflation cannot quite bear to close the horizon. Every commitment is a closing. The third sign is the tendency toward what Jung might have recognized as enantiodromia, the principal pitch by which things, when taken to their extreme, become their opposites. The intuitive mind pushed too far into its own gift too long, without the compensating development of the inferior function, tends to undergo a sudden reversal. The person who has lived entirely in vision and symbol and possibility suddenly becomes obsessed with the most concrete, sensory, physical dimensions of existence. They become preoccupied with the body, its health, its appearance, its physical sensations, in a way that feels alien and unstoppable. Or they become attached to material security with an urgency that contradicts everything they have claimed to value. Or they fall into a kind of deadness. The very perceptual richness that defined their inner life seems to drain away, leaving a flatness that is more alarming than any amount of suffering would have been. This is the unconscious enforcing the balance the ego refused. The fourth sign is the particular loneliness of the intuitive type that has never been examined, the loneliness that comes not from lack of connection, but from the secret belief that true connection is not possible, because true connection would require being fully known. And being fully known would require the intuitive type to be fully present. And full presence requires the sensation function, the capacity to inhabit this moment, this conversation, this specific human being in front of you that the inflation has left undeveloped. The intuitive person in inflation connects, often powerfully and often sincerely, at the level of vision and symbol and shared depth. But the ground level, daily, unheroic intimacies of ordinary human love, the texture of being with someone through the completely unglamorous hours, remain somehow inaccessible, and so the connections, however profound they feel in their peak moments, tend to have a ceiling, and the loneliness persists, not despite the connections, but within them. The fifth sign is the relationship with time. The intuitive type experiences time differently than sensing types. They live, primarily, in the future, in the pattern of where things are going, in the shape of what is approaching. The past is rich with symbolic meaning, perpetually mined for insight. The present is the thinnest of membranes. This is the gift, the capacity to perceive trajectories, to see around corners, to sense what is coming before it arrives. But living primarily in the future means that the present perpetually disappoints. Nothing, that is, can compete with what could be. The achieved goal is already being replaced, in the intuitive mind, by the next possible before it has been fully inhabited. Beauty is glimpsed and immediately translated into symbol rather than simply felt. Love arrives and is immediately being assessed for its potential, where it could go, what it might mean, whether it is the real thing. The moment of arrival is always slightly too small for the journey toward it. Jung did not leave the intuitive type in this shadow. He never simply named the wound and walked away. The entire architecture of his psychology was oriented toward what he called individuation, the lifelong process by which a person becomes as fully as possible what they actually are, not what they were told to be, not what their inflation made them believe they were, but the genuine, specific, irreducible self that was always there, beneath the function, beneath the mask, beneath the myth. For the intuitive type, individuation requires a specific descent, not from thinking into feeling, as some simplified accounts of psychological development suggest. The required descent is from the sky into the earth, from possibility into presences, from symbol into sensation. This is not a renunciation. Jung was clear about this with a clarity that the modern's self-help appropriation of his work has thoroughly obscured. The goal of individuation is not the elimination of the dominant function. The intuitive person does not become less intuitive through psychological development. What happens is more precise and more extraordinary. The inferior function, the sensation function, the capacity for presence in the physical and immediate world, is developed alongside the dominant function, creating a psyche that can move freely between the sky and the ground, between vision and presence, between what could be and what is. Jung called the structure that makes this possible the transcendent function, the capacity of the psyche to hold the tension between two opposites without collapsing into one of them. The intuitive type who has done this work, who has suffered through the confrontation with their own inflation, who has descended into the very ordinary, unglamorous, deeply unflattering encounter with their inferior function, this person becomes something the initial gift alone never could have produced. They become a person who can see and be here, who can perceive what is coming and inhabit what is, who can hold a symbol and simultaneously feel the ground beneath their feet. This is not a small achievement. In Jungian terms, it is nothing less than the creation of a new center of gravity, not the ego, not the dominant function, not the inflation, but the self, which is Jung's term for the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, the deepest organizing principle of the inner world. The dream that precedes this shift in the clinical experience of Jungian analysts across generations often carries a particular image. It varies in detail but maintains its essential form. The dreamer is above and then descends, or the dreamer is flying and lands, or the dreamer encounters something below ground, a treasure, a figure, an animal that draws them down. The descent dream is the psyche announcing its readiness for the work, and it is experienced almost universally as both terrifying and the most real thing the dreamer has ever felt in sleep. The animal that appears in these descent dreams is significant. Jung understood animals in dreams as representations of the instinctual life, the dimension of the psyche that is below ego, below culture, below the elaborate symbolic intelligence of the intuitive mind. For the intuitive type, the animal that appears is often ancient, often quiet, often waiting with a patience that puts the frantic movement of the dreaming mind to shame. A large dog, a serpent, a horse standing still in an open field, a bear at the threshold of a cave. These are not threats, they are ambassadors. They are the body's intelligence, the sensation function in its most primordial form. Arriving in the symbolic language the intuitive mind can actually receive because the door of ordinary sensation remains for now too small. The work in active imagination, one of Jung's specific methods for psychological development, the practice of entering into dialogue with the figures and symbols of the unconscious in a state of wakeful attention, begins by meeting these ambassadors, by sitting with the serpent rather than translating it into metaphor, by allowing the horse to stand still rather than mounting it and riding toward the horizon. This is the discipline the intuitive type finds most foreign and most necessary. The discipline of not knowing yet, of staying in the image before reaching for its meaning, of inhabiting the moment of symbolic encounter before transforming it into the next insight, the next pattern, the next piece of the vision. Jung did not describe this as easy. He described it as the most demanding thing the psyche can undertake. The voluntary descent into what the dominant function has most carefully avoided. There is a specific quality of suffering that belongs to this type and this work that must be named directly, because no one else is naming it with the specificity it deserves. The intuitive mind in the process of individuation passes through a period that resembles, from the outside, depression, and that is experienced from the inside as a peculiar extinguishing. The visions dim, the symbolic richness that was the primary currency of the inner life becomes, for a season, unavailable. The intuitive function, which has been the central identity, the primary source of meaning, the thing the person most depended on to know who they were, goes quiet. This is not pathology. This is the Nigredo, the alchemical stage that Jung used as a symbolic map for psychological transformation. The blackening, the dissolution of the old form before the new form can take shape. For the sensation inferior intuitive type, the Nigredo is experienced as the temporary death of the very thing that made life feel worth living. The perception goes flat. The symbols become inert. The knowing stops arriving. And in that silence, the sensation function can finally begin to speak. For the first time, perhaps the physical world becomes interesting, not as a symbol of something else, not as a stage on which the larger drama of vision and meaning is enacted, but as itself. The texture of an object held in the hand, the specific quality of afternoon light on a particular day, the fact of hunger satisfied, the fact of a body resting. These experiences, which the sensing types have access to as their primary mode of being in the world, and which intuitive type has spent a lifetime effectively skipping, arrive with a freshness that is almost shocking. This is the albedo, the whitening, the second alchemical stage, the emergence of something clean and new from the dissolution of the Nigredo, not a return to what was before, something that could not have existed before the dissolution, and eventually, not quickly, and not without the full passage through the dark, the third stage, rubedo, the reddening, the full integration, the intuitive mind, reunited with its sensation function, returned to the world with its gift intact and its ground established. This is the wounded healer emerging. This is Chiron, carrying the scar that will not heal, and from that scar able to heal others. Jung wrote, and these words are among the most precise and the most challenging he ever set down, that the finding of one's own individuality is always a defeat for the ego. The ego wants to be large. It wants the crown without the descent. It wants the vision without the earth. It wants Prometheus's gift of foreknowledge without the body on the rock. And the psyche, which is wiser than the ego, which operates according to laws older and deeper than the ego's preferences, will not allow this bargain to stand indefinitely. The reckoning comes for the deeply intuitive person in one of several forms. Sometimes it comes as the sudden, bewildering collapse of a life that appeared to be running smoothly, because the neglected inferior function finally extracted its accounting with compound interest. Sometimes it comes as illness, the body's unlistened to for so long, speaking in the only language that forces attention. Sometimes it comes as the midlife encounter that Jung described as a necessary reorientation, the point at which the life that was built by the gifts and drives of the first half must be radically reconsidered in light of everything the first half chose not to see. And sometimes, when the person is both lucky and brave, it comes as a dream, a descent dream, an ambassador dream, an image so specific and so undeniable that the intuitive mind, which has always trusted perception above all else, cannot find a way to look away. This is the moment Jung identified as the threshold of the second life. Not the second half in the simple chronological sense, but the second way of being, the life lived from the whole self rather than from the gift alone. The archetype awakening in you now, the one that belongs to this particular threshold, this particular confrontation, is the Vates, the ancient Latin word for the seer, the prophet, the poet, the one through whom the deeper world speaks. Not the Prometheus still chained, still paying the price for a fire that has not yet been integrated into the hearth. Not the pure still circling the horizon. The Vates, the seer who has descended and returned, whose sight is no longer purchased at the cost of the ground. The Vates appears in mythology and in human history at pivotal moments, not as a figure of power in the ordinary sense, but as a figure of necessary depth. The voice that speaks what the collective cannot yet hear but needs to know. The perception that is offered not as proof of superiority, but as service to a world that has been listening too long to its surfaces. This is the identity that waits for the intuitive person on the other side of the confrontation with their own shadow. Not the brilliant but ungrounded visionary, not the isolated thinker whose depth produces loneliness rather than connection. The Vates, the seer who is here, in this body, in this time with both eyes open. Consider what Carl Jung himself was. He was, by his own classification, an introverted intuitive type. He perceived things, patterns in the unconscious, the shape of the collective shadow, the mythological structures beneath individual biography that the world of his time had no framework to receive. He was called mad. He was called mystical, in the dismissive sense. He lost his closest intellectual relationship, his friendship with Freud, precisely because his perceptions went to depths that the more systematically minded Freud could not follow without abandoning the architecture he had built. Jung descended. After the break with Freud, he entered what himself described as a period of disorientation so profound that he was genuinely uncertain of his own sanity. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He did not immediately understand what he was experiencing. He did not rush to translate the images into theory. He sat with them. He drew them. He built a stone tower with his own hands, sensation brought into matter, as a way of grounding the visions in physical reality. He survived, and what he brought back from the descent became the most comprehensive map of the human psyche that Western psychology has produced. The tower he built still stands on the shore of Lake Zurich, stone by stone, laid by the hands of the man who could perceive the structure of the collective unconscious. The intuitive mind, finally, in the earth. Here is the line that contains the whole of it. The line that is worth writing on the inside of the mind and returning to in every season of confusion. The crown is real, the curse is real, and you were not given the depth of perception so that you could live above the world. You were given it so that you could descend into it further than most and come back with something the world was waiting for without knowing it was waiting. What does it mean, practically, for the intuitive person to begin the descent that Jung described? Not in theory, not as another pattern to perceive from altitude, but as lived practice. It begins with a decision that is entirely foreign to the dominant function, the decision to stop gathering and to start inhabiting. One thing, one relationship, one place, one day. The sensation function does not need a vast horizon. It needs a small, specific, present reality to be genuinely received. The intuitive mind's practice, Jung's active imagination, in the work of individuation, in the unromantic dailiness of psychological development, is to meet the present moment without immediately translating it into significance. To let the light on the wall be light on the wall before it becomes a symbol. To let the person across the table be this person now, before they become an archetypal figure in the larger story. This is not a diminishment of the gift, it is its maturation. Jung described the self, the goal of individuation, the integrated totality, as having the quality of wholeness, precisely because it contains the opposites, the intuitive and the sensate, the sky and the ground, the prophet and the persons, the crown and the earth beneath it. You do not become less yourself through this descent. You become, for the first time, fully yourself, the person who has carried this kind of mind through this kind of life, who has known what others did not know, who has seen what others could not see, who has paid the price of that knowing in loneliness and misunderstanding and the persistent ache of a life that has not quite fully landed. This person has not been cursed. They have been, in the oldest and most precise sense of the word, initiated. Initiation, in every culture that has ever used the word with real understanding, involves suffering that is purposeful, not random suffering, not punitive suffering, but the specific suffering that transforms the one who passes through it into something that could not have existed without the passage. The intuitive mind pressed to its limits by its own gift, failing in the ways it must fail before it can succeed in the deeper way, descending through the Nigredo into the silence where the inferior function waits. This is initiation. You were not broken by the depth you carry. You were shaped by it, and you are not finished. Carl Jung, in his autobiography Memories, Dreams, Reflections, one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of psychology, a book that reads less like a memoir than like a map of an unmapped interior country, wrote near the end of his life, "I have frequently seen people become neurotic when they content themselves with inadequate or wrong answers to the questions of life. They seek position, marriage, reputation, outward success or money, and remain unhappy and neurotic even when they have attained what they were seeking. Such people are usually confined within too narrow a spiritual horizon. The deeply intuitive person has never been confined to a narrow spiritual horizon. That has been both the glory and the difficulty. The horizon was always too wide. The perception always exceeded the capacity of the structures available to contain it. The work, the Jungian work, the individuation work, the real work, is not to narrow the horizon. It is to build a life large enough to hold both the horizon and the ground on which you stand, wide enough for the vision, deep enough for the roots. That is the self that is waiting. That is the crown worn without cost. If this reached into something real, something that has never quite been named in the ordinary conversations of your life, then you already know what to do with it. Not analyze it, not immediately translate it into the next insight. Sit with it. Let it be present. Let the symbol land before you send it skyward again. And if you know someone who thinks in this way, who carries this kind of perception, this particular combination of depth and loneliness and undeniable gift, share this with them, not as an explanation, as an act of accompaniment. The deeply intuitive person, more than anything, needs to know that their way of moving through the world has been seen. Subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like if something here struck the specific frequency of your actual experience. There is more work being done here, more mapping of the territory Jung charted, more precision about the specific experience of the people who need this most. We are building this quietly together, and the next exploration is already waiting. The unconscious has no impatience. It has been waiting for you your entire life. It will wait a little longer, but the door is open now. The question is only whether you will walk through it.